Sunrise Estates sat at the edge of the bustling city of Henderson Grove. From the outside, it looked like the ideal place to raise a family. Immaculate sidewalks, trimmed hedges, pastel-painted houses with matching shutters. The roads meandered gently, lined with blooming crepe myrtles that gave the streets a dreamy pink and white hue in springtime. Every family who moved here was given the same sales pitch. We're a tight-knit community. Our HOA keeps everything running smoothly. And indeed, property values stayed high, and most neighbors kept up warm facades. Children rode bikes in cul-de-sacs, while retirees planted perfectly aligned rose gardens. Yet under the surface, a strict homeowners association, empowered by extensive bylaws, kept the neighborhood in an unrelenting grip. Morning joggers whispered about monthly fines for trivial matters, a slightly overgrown lawn or a mailbox in the wrong shade of gray. Packages sometimes went missing or were misplaced at the HOA office for alleged label infractions. Residents shrugged off these annoyances, believing it was worth the trade-off of living in a pristine environment. Within this backdrop, few suspected that one individual would soon push the concept of rule enforcement far beyond its limits, culminating in a shocking act that threatened a child's life. Her name was Marcia Downing, though behind her back, nearly everyone called her Karen. Before Karen became a neighborhood threat, she was simply Marcia Downing, a 50-something woman who had moved into Sunrise Estates shortly after her divorce. Rumor had it she'd once been involved in property management, but her stories changed from one conversation to the next. Some days she claimed she was a retired real estate broker. Other days, she hinted she'd worked in legal offices. What was consistent, however, was her eagerness to volunteer on the HOA. Within months of moving in, she joined the board. She started as secretary, but soon unofficially acted like she wore every hat: treasurer, compliance officer, and the final word on any community dispute. Her vanity license plate read, HOA Guru. Karen relished the details of Sunrise Estates regulations, from the correct brand of mulch for front gardens to the precise measurements for children's basketball hoops. She took it upon herself to educate newcomers, often with stern lectures that left them feeling like chastised schoolchildren. Those who challenged her discovered she had an arsenal of official-sounding letters and fines. Her fervor for control was not limited to lawns and paint colors. She prowled the streets, ensuring cars parked exactly parallel to curbs, that garbage cans were retrieved from the street by 6 p.m. on trash day, and that no one hung wind chimes or flags without an official permit. When neighbors grumbled, she called them unpatriotic or lazy. The more she antagonized people, the more confident she became that her judgment was the only one that mattered. In hushed tones, a handful of residents started using the name Karen to describe her behind her back. If she overheard it, she would simply smirk. Better a Karen than a lawbreaker, she'd say, fully convinced that Sunrise Estates owed its impeccable reputation to her vigilance. No one realized just how dangerous that vigilance could become when fixated on the smallest of perceived transgressions. During a mild spring, Ethan and Laurel Thompson arrived with their 2 children, Amy, 8, and Nathan, 5. They bought a modest but cozy 2-story home on Oak Leaf Court, drawn by the top-rated schools and safe environment. Laurel, a nurse at the local hospital, liked the idea of a supportive community. Ethan, who worked as an IT consultant from home, relished the neighborhood's quiet charm. From the moment the moving truck backed into their driveway, Karen hovered. She showed up the next day with a printed list of important guidelines and a forced smile. Laurel politely listened, though she was taken aback by the severity of some rules. Trash cans out only between 5 a.m. and 6 p.m. on collection day, Karen explained, tapping the paper with a manicured fingernail. Grass must be no taller than 2 inches. And absolutely no skateboard ramps in the driveways. Ethan, eager to keep peace, nodded. We'll keep that in mind. Karen's gaze drifted to Amy and Nathan chasing each other on the lawn. Make sure they know not to run onto neighbors' properties, she said sternly, as if stepping on another patch of grass was a moral failing. Then she turned briskly, heading off to her next inspection. The Thompsons shrugged it off. They'd heard stories of overbearing HOAs, but they assumed Karen was just a fussy neighbor with too much free time. They resolved to abide by the rules, hoping to avoid conflict. Little did they suspect that their innocent, energetic children would soon be at the center of Karen's most terrifying act. Over the next few weeks, Ethan and Laurel got to know their neighbors. Some were friendly, quietly rolling their eyes at any mention of Karen's name. Others, especially older residents, seemed wary about even discussing the HOA, as if fear overshadowed frustration. Still, the Thompsons enjoyed the neat sidewalks where the kids biked, in the playground tucked behind a row of houses. Amy and Nathan were thrilled to have so many tidy yards and safe streets for their games. But they noticed something odd. Whenever they played hopscotch or ran around with sidewalk chalk, Karen would drive by in her small SUV, slowing to watch them. One afternoon, as Amy jumped rope in front of her own house, Karen parked, got out, and inspected the sidewalk for chalk marks, then glared at Amy as though she'd defaced public property. Laurel tried to keep perspective. "As long as the kids aren't harming anything, we'll be fine," she told Ethan. She can't actually punish them for being children. But an uneasy feeling nagged at Ethan. He'd heard stories from coworkers who had lived in similarly strict HOAs, stories of inflated fines and bizarre vendettas. "Let's just watch ourselves around her," he said. "We don't need a feud." Meanwhile, Karen continued patrolling Oakleaf Court. She tapped on mailboxes if she deemed them unclean, left notes about recycling bins not being flush against the curb, and occasionally demanded to see local dog owners' pet licensing paperwork. If anyone asked why she was so intense, Karen answered with that frosty smile, "I'm protecting our community standards." This tension simmered just below the surface, waiting for a spark. Karen's controlling nature and the children's unbridled energy would soon ignite a confrontation far more shocking than the usual petty disputes. Karen relished her influence, but deep down she was frustrated. Recently, the broader HOA board had started questioning her methods. A few newly elected members found her approach too heavy-handed, and neighbors had submitted complaints. While Karen had no intention of quitting, she felt her authority threatened. She diverted that tension into micromanaging the smallest neighborhood details. Late spring brought hotter days, temperatures sometimes soared into the 90s. As families opened windows and children splashed in sprinklers, Karen saw more violations. Plastic kiddie pools left out after dark? Fined. Bicycles leaning against mailboxes? Fined. During a phone call with her close ally on the board, she vented, "We can't let these people get away with it, or next they'll paint their shutters neon green." She convinced herself that even children's playtime needed strict oversight. Where the board told her to lighten up, she doubled down. Ethan Thompson's children became a particular point of fixation. They were friendly, spirited, and by Karen's standards, undisciplined. She complained to Laurel once that Nathan ran across the grass in the vacant lot next door without permission, as if it were a cardinal sin. Laurel apologized politely, but Karen wasn't satisfied. "Does that woman not care about rules?" Karen would hiss under her breath while driving past their house. No wonder her kids run amok. She began to watch the Thompsons' comings and goings more closely. If the kids stayed on the sidewalk, fine. If they so much as grazed a neighbor's lawn or left a plastic ball in the street, Karen scribbled notes in a small spiral-bound violation tracker. It was a bizarre escalation for such minor issues. But in Karen's mind, protecting Sunrise Estates was paramount, and the battle had to be won, even if it meant confronting an 8-year-old about chalk lines on the sidewalk. One scorching afternoon in early June, Amy and Nathan rummaged through the garage, finding an old bubble machine. Excited, they set it up in the driveway, letting hundreds of iridescent bubbles float across Oakleaf Court. Laurel, just off a hospital shift, sat on a patio chair, enjoying the show. Soon, some bubbles drifted onto the neighbor's yard, an empty property waiting to be listed for sale. The kids followed the bubbles with laughter, skipping onto the vacant lawn. They were still well within the boundaries of the vacant lot, but they also happened to pass in front of Karen's driveway at one point. By sheer coincidence, Karen arrived home from an HOA meeting. She spotted the children on the unoccupied lawn property that, according to her, was not open for public use. Furious at the sight, she parked abruptly. Marching toward the kids, she scolded them. "This is private property. You can't just do whatever you want. Where are your parents?" Amy and Nathan stared, wide-eyed. Laurel stood up, calling out, "They're right here, and they're just playing with bubbles. No harm done." Karen's glare sharpened. A mother letting her children trespass? This is exactly what I've been warning people about. Careless behavior that ruins neighborhoods. Laurel, too tired to engage in a fight, tried to de-escalate. "We'll keep them in our yard. They were just following bubbles." Karen snapped photos of the children with her phone, muttering about documenting the violation. She shot Laurel a final searing look. "If I see them again on someone else's property, there will be consequences." Then she turned and stomped away. Laurel felt a surge of anger and worry. Documenting a child's harmless bubble chasing as though it were a crime? Something about Karen's intensity unsettled her. She decided to keep the kids closer to home, not wanting more run-ins. But Karen's fury only grew, and as the summer sun rose higher, So did the stakes. June edged into July, and the temperature climbed. A thick, humid heat wave settled over Sunrise Estates, with daily highs reaching the upper 90s. Most families cope by staying indoors with the air conditioning or visiting the community pool. Children's outdoor play shifted to earlier mornings or late evenings to avoid the scorching midday sun. Karen saw this as an opportunity. Less foot traffic during peak heat meant fewer eyes watching her as she continued her self-appointed patrols. She watched the Thompsons from a distance, noting when their children went outside, how long they stayed, and whether they crossed any lines. One day, she found a small patch of chalk drawings on the sidewalk near the Thompsons' mailbox. She rang the doorbell, showing Laurel a phone snapshot. "You have to clean this up right away. I've already told you, no unsanctioned markings. Some folks could slip." Laurel, exasperated, used a bucket of water and a broom to erase the drawings. The kids apologized, though they were confused by the harsh reaction. That evening, after the sun dipped below the horizon, Karen typed a scathing email to the HOA board. She demanded stricter rules on children's outdoor activities, calling it a public hazard. The board's president, Ted Marshall, politely reminded her that they didn't regulate children's chalk drawings. Sunrise Estates wasn't a prison yard. Annoyed and feeling rebuffed, Karen decided the official channels weren't enough. She would handle things personally. In Karen's mind, the children's parents were negligent. She told herself that if the parents wouldn't rein the kids in, maybe there was a way to show them the potential dangers of letting children roam, unchecked. It was a twisted rationale, fueled by her ever-growing sense of righteous indignation. No one could predict the horrifying lengths she would go to teach them a lesson. A blistering July afternoon arrived. The forecast predicted 98 degrees Fahrenheit with oppressive humidity. By mid-morning, Karen paced her living room, sipping iced tea but feeling none of its refreshing effect. She peeked through half-drawn blinds at the Thompsons' house across the street. She'd seen Nathan earlier, running around with a small soccer ball in the front yard. "They're at it again," she muttered. She began concocting a scenario that would terrify the family into compliance. Her logic was disturbingly warped. If they truly understood the dangers of letting a child roam, they'd keep them in line. She fixated on the idea that children needed to be controlled, that parents who couldn't manage them were unfit. A fleeting notion crossed her mind, something about leaving a child in a car to show how dangerous it could be if they wandered inside without supervision. Of course, no rational person would enact such a plan. But Karen's vendetta had spiraled beyond rationality. She believed that scaring them for a few minutes would be enough. No permanent harm, just a dose of reality. She managed to convince herself that this was a public service. That afternoon, Karen made a trip to a store a few miles away, picking up groceries and returning with her trunk full. She noticed the oppressive heat, how the car interior felt like an oven. A twisted part of her mind labeled the condition the perfect demonstration. She told herself she wouldn't go too far, just enough to create fear or teach a lesson. But once someone steps onto such a dangerous path, the lines between lesson and abuse vanish. The stage was set for a catastrophic incident that would leave Sunrise Estates reeling. Late afternoon on that scorching day, Karen spotted Nathan Thompson playing in the side yard, while Laurel sat under a patio umbrella, flipping through a magazine. Ethan was inside on a work call. Feeling emboldened, Karen pulled her SUV out, leaving it parked at the curb in front of her house with the engine off. The interior was already hot from the midday sun. She watched as Nathan's ball rolled near the sidewalk. Seizing her moment, Karen hurried across the street under the pretense of retrieving something. She called out in a friendly tone, "Hey, want to see something cool in my car?" Nathan, only 5, recognized her as the neighbor who was always around. Despite her sternness, he had no real reason to suspect danger. He shrugged and ambled over, curiosity piqued. Karen opened the rear passenger door. The seat was roasting, but she acted casual. "Hop in for a second. I have a cool surprise." Confused but trusting, Nathan climbed inside. Without hesitation, Karen slammed the door and hit the lock button on her key fob. A click echoed. Nathan tried the door handle, nothing. He pressed his face to the window, startled. Karen walked a few steps away, phone in hand, as if waiting. The plan was to scare him just enough so that he'd realize how unsafe it was. But in her twisted logic, she was ignoring the lethal heat. Within seconds, Nathan's small forehead beaded with sweat, tears forming in his eyes. He tapped on the window, but Karen only stared, half rigid with her own misguided resolution. From across the street, Laurel looked up to see Nathan's soccer ball abandoned. She heard muffled crying. Alarm shot through her. She jumped up and ran to the sidewalk. her blood turning cold as she realized her son was locked in Karen's SUV. Nathan's face was red, tears streaming, small fist pounding the window in panic. "What are you doing?" Laurel screamed, rushing at Karen. The older woman's expression wavered between stern resolve and fleeting doubt. "He'll be fine," Karen snapped, but her voice shook. "He needs to learn not to wander around cars. It's dangerous out here." Laurel's heart thundered. She clawed at the door handles, only to find them locked. "Open it. Open it now," she shrieked. Neighbors, drawn by the commotion, began to emerge. Some sprinted over, phone cameras recording. The air was thick with disbelief. This was no petty HOA complaint, but a child locked in a searing hot vehicle. The temperature inside the car soared with each second. Nathan's crying turned to gasping sobs. At that pivotal moment, a figure stepped onto the scene, Miriam Howard, a Child Protective Services (CPS) investigator who happened to be visiting another family on the block for an unrelated case. She had heard the shouting and rushed over. One glance at Nathan's trapped figure and the sweat streaming down his face told her everything. She'd seen far too many cases of heat stroke and kids left in cars. She shouted at Karen, voice shaking with controlled fury, "Unlock this door, or you're going to jail, now." Karen froze, her knuckles white on the key fob. She stammered, I was just, he was," but she couldn't finish. In the span of seconds, a wave of reality crashed over her. She was endangering this child's life. As neighbors poured onto Oak Leaf Court, chaos reigned. Laurel banged on the SUV window, tears streaming down her face. Meanwhile, Miriam Howard tried to keep the crowd calm, but her own panic was evident. Time was critical in a hot car scenario. Karen stood immobile, seemingly paralyzed by the confrontation. Perhaps the outcry from neighbors jolted her from her delusion. She fumbled with the key fob, her hands shaking. After what felt like an eternity, the car's locks clicked open. Laurel wrenched the door wide, scooping Nathan into her arms. The boy's face was flushed, his breathing shallow, shirt drenched with sweat. Miriam, rushing over, quickly assessed Nathan's condition, pressing her palm to his forehead. He was conscious but disoriented, tears streaking his cheeks. She barked at onlookers to call an ambulance. "He needs to be cooled down. Someone get water, ice packs, anything." A neighbor ran for a hose. Another grabbed cold towels from their kitchen. In the swirl of commotion, Ethan burst out of the house, phone still in hand from his business call. Upon seeing his son limp in Laurel's arms, he went pale. "What happened?" His voice cracked. No one could fully answer amid the frantic attempts to help Nathan. Karen retreated several paces, eyes darting from face to face. She stuttered, I didn't mean," but the crowd's horror overshadowed her. They stared at her as though she were a monster. In the distance, the wail of sirens grew louder. Within minutes, paramedics arrived. They ushered Nathan into an ambulance, applying cold compresses, checking vitals. Miriam Howard spoke quietly with the paramedics, relaying that the child had been locked in a hot vehicle, which was tantamount to child endangerment. Karen lingered on the curb, heart pounding. She tried to reason with herself. Surely, once she explained, they'd see she only meant to teach a lesson. But the scathing looks from neighbors told another story. She had crossed an unthinkable line. And it wasn't just outraged neighbors she had to worry about. The law had plenty to say about what she'd done. Miriam Howard's presence was pivotal. As a Child Protective Services investigator, she had immediate authority to act when a child's welfare was at stake. She followed the ambulance to the hospital, ensuring Nathan received the care he needed. Laurel and Ethan accompanied their son, frantic for reassurance he'd be all right. Back on Oak Leaf Court, Miriam's CPS colleague, who'd also arrived in the swirl of events, stayed behind to gather statements from witnesses. Residents lined up, each describing Karen's history of overreach, culminating in this horrifying stunt. Some had even recorded cell phone videos capturing Karen locking Nathan in the car. The footage showed the child's frantic pleas and Karen's refusal to open the door until confronted. Word spread fast around Sunrise Estates. People realized this was no simple HOA meltdown or petty complaint. A child had nearly succumbed to heat stroke in Karen's vehicle. Disbelief morphed into collective rage. Miriam's colleague, Brenda Valentine, took the statements. "We will forward everything to law enforcement," she told the shaken neighbors. "This is beyond a CPS matter. It's criminal child abuse and endangerment." At that moment, a local patrol car arrived, lights flashing. Officers stepped out, scanning the shocked crowd. Their radio transmissions indicated they were responding to a child endangerment in progress. Karen stood off to the side, hugging her elbows, eyes wide. She tried to wave at the officers, but they brushed past her, eager to speak with CPS and eyewitnesses first. For years, Karen had hidden behind the veneer of community regulations, dishing out harsh judgments. Now, faced with actual legal authorities, she'd find that no self-appointed rule could protect her from the real consequences of endangering a child. Officers Angela Powers and Timothy Greer quickly took control of the scene. After conferring with CPS investigator Brenda Valentine, they approached Karen. She looked pale, sweat beading on her brow. Her voice shook as she tried to rationalize. I just wanted to show how dangerous it can be. If he crawled into a hot car on his own, I was preventing a future tragedy. Officer Powers' gaze hardened. Ma'am, you locked a child in a car in extreme heat. That is not a lesson, it's endangerment. Do you understand how many children die from overheating every year? Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Some neighbors scowled at her, arms crossed. Others murmured curses under their breath. The entire community realized the gravity of her actions. This wasn't an HOA matter. This was child abuse, plain and simple. The officers led Karen to the squad car, where they read her Miranda rights. She attempted a feeble protest. I'm on the HOA board. I have authority. Officer Greer cut her off. Your HOA status doesn't allow you to imprison a child in a hot vehicle. You're under arrest for child endangerment, among other potential charges. A hush fell over the bystanders, punctuated by a few gasps. Karen Downing, the self-styled savior of Sunrise Estates, was handcuffed right there on Oak Leaf Court, in full view of everyone she had once intimidated. She was placed in the back of the patrol car, her face reflecting a mix of shock and denial. The realization that her life was about to be upended, perhaps irreparably, seemed to crash over her like a wave. Officer Powers then spoke to the neighbors. If any of you have photos, videos, or statements, please share them with us. We intend to gather all the evidence for a thorough investigation. Many nodded, exchanging anxious looks. They had never imagined their community's biggest worry, an overzealous HOA official, would escalate to a felony arrest. The police car pulled away, carrying Karen to the local station. A swirl of emotions rippled through Sunrise Estates. Horror, anger, and a strange measure of relief. For years, Karen's tyranny had weighed on them with fines and threats. Now, her downfall was as swift as it was shocking. But no one took joy in the tragedy overshadowing a child's near-death experience. Meanwhile, the hospital treated Nathan Thompson for heat exhaustion. Paramedics had acted quickly, preventing more severe complications like organ damage. Laurel and Ethan hovered by his bedside, consumed by guilt and fury. They couldn't fathom how a neighbor, someone entrusted with community well-being, had nearly cost them their son's life. Child Protective Services, though initially present for a different matter, pivoted to investigate the immediate situation. They confirmed that no blame lay with the Thompsons for this horrifying event. In fact, they offered resources to help the family cope with the trauma. Nathan, traumatized and frightened, would likely need therapy. Across the neighborhood, residents exchanged phone calls and messages, trying to process the shocking sequence. Some recounted their run-ins with Karen, haunted by the realization that her controlling impulses had escalated to this criminal act. The HOA board members scheduled an emergency meeting to address the scandal, fearing legal repercussions for the entire association. Yet, nothing overshadowed the central crisis. A 5-year-old boy had nearly died from heat entrapment, orchestrated by an overzealous neighbor. For Sunrise Estates, life would never be the same. At the hospital, doctors assured Laurel and Ethan that Nathan would physically recover. His core temperature had been dangerously high, but the swift rescue spared him from lasting damage. Still, the emotional wounds ran deep. Nathan whimpered at the slightest mention of cars, clinging to Laurel whenever a nurse came in to check vitals. Amy, who had witnessed the commotion, was inconsolable. She had stayed with a neighbor during the hospital visit, crying that her brother almost died. That evening, Ethan brought Amy to the hospital, letting the siblings see each other so they could begin to process what happened. Meanwhile, Laurel oscillated between relief that Nathan survived and white-hot anger at Karen. How could she do this? Over some petty rules, she sobbed, hands shaking around a styrofoam cup of hospital coffee. Ethan tried to console her, but he was equally shaken. "I can't believe we moved here thinking it was safe," he said in a broken whisper. "Never in a million years did I think a neighbor would do something like this." The staff at the hospital, accustomed to accidents and illnesses, found themselves grappling with the horror that an adult had deliberately locked a child in a hot car. They offered support, connecting the Thompsons with counselors. Nathan's nurse gently explained the typical psychological effects such an ordeal could have, urging them to begin therapy as soon as possible. All the while, Laurel's phone buzzed with messages, calls from neighbors, the HOA president, and even local reporters who had caught wind of the story. But she ignored them, focusing solely on Nathan. Their once idyllic vision of Sunrise Estates had turned into a nightmare. Now, they just wanted to see their child safe and stable. Back at Sunrise Estates, the HOA board convened in an impromptu session at the community clubhouse. Normally, these meetings were formal, with an agenda and minutes. But in the wake of Karen's arrest, it felt more like a crisis council. Board President Ted Marshall looked grim. "We have a massive problem. Karen's actions have put the entire neighborhood under scrutiny. The media is calling, and I've even received questions from local government officials about our oversight." Paula Thompson, no relation to Ethan's family, was a new board member. She had been skeptical of Karen's heavy-handed approach from the start. "We can't just wave this off. Did anyone here know she'd do something like that? Did we ever give her that kind of power?" A hush fell. Though no one had explicitly authorized Karen to commit a crime, they knew they'd turned a blind eye to her smaller acts of aggression for years. They had shrugged off her countless complaints and fines, grateful she handled the dirty work of enforcement. Now, that complacency weighed heavily on them. A middle-aged member who once aligned with Karen on strict policies looked pale. "I never wanted this. Sure, I believed in strong guidelines to maintain property values, but not endangering children." Ted nodded, massaging his temples. "We need to protect the HOA from liability. We'll issue a public statement condemning Karen's actions as personal, not related to official policy." He paused, face taut with worry. "But we also need to review how much authority we've let her wield without checks. This tragedy might spark lawsuits." It was agreed they would suspend Karen from any HOA role, effective immediately. They also decided to hire an outside consultant to audit the association's compliance protocols. Over the next few days, they drafted an official press release, disclaiming responsibility. Still, the entire board felt uneasy. What if a court found the HOA complicit in fostering an environment that enabled Karen? None of them had easy answers. Sunrise Estates was about to face public outrage and possible legal ramifications, all stemming from one woman's heinous act. Despite the horror, a silver lining emerged. Neighbors banded together to support the Thompsons. People who had previously only exchanged curt nods now visited the family with home-cooked meals or offers to babysit Amy while Nathan recovered. A group of mothers organized a small donation drive to help cover any extra medical or counseling expenses for the family. In online community forums, residents raged about Karen's actions, sharing stories of their run-ins with her. A mother posted about how Karen once scolded her toddler for stepping on a flower bed, while another father recounted how Karen threatened to fine him for installing a small basketball hoop on his driveway. These anecdotes, once viewed as petty annoyances, took on a darker shade now that Karen's controlling streak had crossed into outright criminal territory. A few sympathetic souls tried to argue that Karen might have had good intentions gone awry, but that sentiment quickly fizzled under the onslaught of condemnation. "There's no justification for endangering a child," wrote one neighbor. "She belongs in jail," echoed many others. At the same time, a local charity that specialized in helping families recover from trauma reached out, offering the Thompsons free resources, counseling, emotional support groups, and even an educational workshop on child safety. Moved by the wave of kindness, Laurel and Ethan began to feel like they weren't alone. For the first time, they saw the true potential of a community, people coming together to help, rather than harm. Within a week of the incident, charges against Karen were formalized. The county district attorney announced she would be prosecuted for felony child endangerment, possibly with additional enhancements given the deliberate nature of her act. Public sentiment was overwhelmingly harsh. No one in Sunrise Estates could recall a time so many reporters canvassed their peaceful streets. Karen, out on bail for the moment, was confined to her home, a place that had once been her vantage point to spy on neighbors. Paparazzi-style photos emerged online. Karen behind closed blinds, appearing disheveled, as though the weight of her crime pressed down on her every moment. Multiple neighbors who documented her harassment came forward, volunteering statements to the prosecution. The district attorney's office seized phone videos capturing the exact moment Karen locked Nathan in her car, plus the frantic aftermath. Child Protective Services turned over their own investigative notes, which described the event as a flagrant disregard for a child's well-being. Civil lawsuits also loomed. The Thompsons, still reeling, explored legal options. Laurel's fury was palpable. "She nearly killed my son," she told a family friend, tears brimming in her eyes. "I want to ensure no one else suffers the same terror." Their attorney hinted that the HOA might share liability if it had enabled Karen's patterns of abusive conduct. Meanwhile, the HOA board's official statement tried to distance itself. "Ms. Downing's actions do not reflect the policies or values of Sunrise Estates. We condemn any harm to a child." But many residents felt the statement was too little, too late, fueling discussions about recalling board members and overhauling the entire association. 2 months later, an initial hearing took place at the Henderson Grove County Courthouse. The pews were packed with journalists, neighbors, and curious onlookers. Laurel and Ethan sat with a small group of supporters, including CPS Representative Miriam Howard, who had intervened on that fateful day. Karen appeared in a modest gray blazer, her once meticulously styled hair now limp. Her defense attorney argued she had only acted out of a misguided attempt at a safety demonstration, and that the child was locked in for less than a couple of minutes. The prosecutor, however, unleashed a barrage of evidence. Phone footage showing Karen intentionally ignoring Nathan's cries, eyewitness testimonies describing how she refused to unlock the car until confronted. In a calm yet firm tone, the prosecutor accused Karen of wanton disregard for a vulnerable minor's life. She pointed out that the scorching summer heat could have proven fatal within minutes. "There's no logical justification for deliberately locking a child in a 100-plus degree vehicle," the prosecutor declared. Karen's expression remained stoic, but she winced whenever the phone recordings played, amplifying Nathan's frantic sobs. She tried to avoid looking at Laurel, who glared at her with raw anger from across the aisle. As the hearing concluded, the judge found sufficient cause to proceed to trial, denying any motion to dismiss. Karen was remanded into custody pending the next court date, citing her actions as grievously irresponsible and potentially lethal. The bail conditions tightened, and she faced the real prospect of a lengthy prison sentence. Leaving the courtroom, Ethan quietly placed an arm around Laurel's shoulder. They both felt a measure of relief. Justice, at least, was on course. The subsequent trial took place several months later, with the entire community watching closely. Some families from Sunrise Estates attended in support of the Thompsons, providing moral backing and additional testimony about Karen's extreme behaviors. The prosecution methodically dismantled any notion of a mere accident. They highlighted Karen's repeated grievances about the Thompson children and her proven track record of overenforcement. Karen's defense tried to reduce the charge to reckless endangerment, but the jury seemed unmoved by pleas that it was a momentary lapse. The horrifying video footage, combined with the testimony of the CPS official and the paramedics, painted a stark picture of a deliberate, punitive act. When the jury returned a verdict of guilty on felony child endangerment, gasps and muffled exclamations echoed through the courtroom. Karen's shoulders slumped, tears welled in her eyes. Yet for many who had lived under her intimidation, the verdict felt like a necessary reckoning. At sentencing, the judge delivered a scathing rebuke. "Your position in the HOA did not give you license to break the law or endanger a child's life. This community entrusted you to preserve order, and you betrayed that trust. Locking a child in a stifling vehicle was an act of malice." Then came the punishment: 8 years in state prison, plus a significant financial penalty to cover damages, therapy costs for Nathan, and punitive restitution for the family suffering. The judge also allowed the Thompsons to seek additional civil remedies. If Karen failed to pay, her assets, including her Sunrise Estates home, would be subject to seizure. Karen was led away in handcuffs, no longer the self-proclaimed watchdog of Sunrise Estates, but a convicted felon whose arrogance had led her to ruin. In the aftermath of Karen's conviction, Sunrise Estates moved forward with sweeping reforms. The HOA board underwent a recall vote that replaced several members, particularly those who had once turned a blind eye to Karen's excessive tactics. A new slate of board members emerged, committed to creating guidelines that protected quality of life without enabling petty tyranny. Laurel and Ethan Thompson focused on helping Nathan and Amy heal. With the help of child psychologists, Nathan gradually overcame his fear of cars. The community stepped up, organizing fundraisers to assist with medical bills and counseling. Parents banded together, fostering a renewed sense of unity. Never again would they let one person impose such terror. Karen's property was eventually sold in a court-ordered auction. The house she once patrolled from her window found new owners, a quiet, retired couple who had no taste for drama. It was as though the neighborhood was purging itself of a dark chapter. While many residents still felt anger and confusion about how things had escalated so horribly, a shared determination emerged. Sunrise Estates would become a place of genuine community, not an arena for a power-hungry individual. The new board held open forums, inviting families to voice concerns and shape guidelines collectively. For the Thompsons, life slowly regained stability. Nathan returned to school, forging new friendships, no longer seeing a monster across the street but a supportive cluster of neighbors. Laurel continued her nursing job, grateful for each moment with her children. Ethan resumed working from home, relieved that the neighborhood's watchful eyes were now those of caring neighbors, not a self-proclaimed Karen bent on control. The legacy of that scorching day remained a cautionary tale. Children's laughter once again filled Oak Leaf Court, this time unburdened by the shadow of overzealous supervision. Indeed, if any moral endured, it was that even well-intended rules can become lethal weapons in the hands of someone who prizes control over compassion. Unchecked entitlement can spiral into criminal acts, and in the end, justice will hold such behavior to account.